Okay, so for switching the weapons, I separated that into a separate FSM. So the inventory management FSM handles adding the weapons to the inventory, taking them from the world, putting them into the player's inventory. And so I made another FSM. Remember, we do that with add component, just type FSM in there and add a playmaker FSM. And I called this one weapon equip FSM. So I'm just going to click the edit button next to it to open that up. And as you can see, there's more states. All right, this isn't the most complex thing I've seen done in Playmaker, but it's probably one of the more complex things you guys are going to see this semester. So this is going to have some stuff that we're going to have to just talk about slowly and go through it, right? So we have this initialized state, and when I was making this, I didn't know what I was going to need to put in there. I just always make an initialized state right after start, and this set bool value was one of those reasons why I always do things like that. So I have this set bool value, which sets a bool variable called reset, and then I have a next frame event, and we'll talk about that a little bit later as to what that's all about. This gets used much later when we get to the array get next action. We use this set bool value to tell us when do we need to start over on the array, and that cuts down on, like, if you remember, we have this little bug that happens on switching weapons. So I'm going to go over here and I'm going to pick up the sword, and I'm going to press F to switch weapons. Nothing happens. I press F again, the weapon switches, right? And so now it behaves just how I want it to, and if I go and pick up another weapon, it continues to work the way I want it, and there's no real delay there. So if I don't set that reset flag, every time I get to the end of the array, I have to press F twice to reset it. So that's why we have to do that. So just know that we're going to be setting that up. So for now, your initialized state when you're first starting out with this is just it should be blank. Default disable. So this what is this doing? Let's see, weapon for deactivation. So okay, so we're setting a variable weapon for deactivation. So what we're doing is we're setting up the default weapon for its first run at being disabled. So I'm going ahead here and I'm saving the player's wooden sword to the weapon for deactivation, right? So you're going to need all of these variables here, right? So this weapon for deactivation is a game object variable that you should add, and what we do is we're saving which weapon eventually gets deactivated at this deactivate current right here. So I'm sorry, I know I'm repeating myself a lot here, but I'm hoping you guys get everything that's going on here, because it's a little complex, and it would take, like, no joke, like 6 to 8 hours to make a video of setting this all up. It's actually quicker to just talk about it. So we're setting the player wooden sword into the weapon for deactivation variable, and I'm getting the array length of the equipable weapons, right? Remember, if you go to our inventory manager, is this right here, right? So equipable weapons is the array, is the global array, right? So it's a global game object array that we're writing to, and the size that I'm doing here, getting the length, that's basically how big is the array, how many game objects are in there. So at the start, right, I've got number of weapons, right? That's 1, right? I've got 1 object. I have 1 actual weapon because I've got my player sword, my wooden sword. I'm going to go up here. I'm going to go ahead and get these. Right, so that hasn't updated yet, but if I press F and I start changing, you see that the number of weapons gets updated. I'll go through that one more time here, and I'll just grab 1 weapon. update it, and then there it goes. And that's because I'm not updating the total number of weapons right away. And actually, you know what? I think that might be the cause of my bug. Yeah, no, it's not actually, because it is updating in time. All right, well, let's see here. Okay. So anyway, I get the number of weapons by getting the size of array, equipable weapons, length, and I'm saving it to a new variable called number of weapons, and you could do this variable right here on that menu. The next thing that happens is we go into a state called listen. You guys are familiar with that one? And what this does, this basically just waits for, hey, let's change weapons, right? I'm using F to change weapons. So I want to show you something here. So here I am, I'm in the state to change weapons, and I press F. You know, I've only got my default sword, I haven't picked up any other weapons, and I press F, and I'm doing a check. I'm checking if I've got more than one weapon to actually switch to. If I don't do that, the array get next action doesn't like it when you try to cycle through an array with a length of 1. So I had to put this in here to stop some slightly weird behavior. So basically it checks to see if I have more than one weapon. If I don't, then nothing happens. It goes back to listen. To set that up, we go ahead, we get the array length of all the weapons, right? So it's basically we're doing this again, right? But what doing it here checks for is like in case like, oh, if I go here and I pick up another weapon, I'm not going back here to set the array length on the default disable. So I need this action again. And then I'm using an action called int compare, which is short for integer compare. So basically this is comparing two whole numbers, basically numbers without decimal points. It's comparing the number of weapons to 1. So what that's basically doing is like, hey, if I have one weapon, right? So if the number of weapons is equal to 1, that means I only have one weapon. My array's length is only 1. There's no point in cycling anything, right? There's nothing to cycle. So it basically goes back to the listen state. If it's greater than 1, right? So that's what this greater than means, right? Do this action. So if it's greater than 1, it goes to the continue event. And continue then goes over here to deactivate game object. And we just, you know, we're deactivating the weapon for deactivation, right? So remember, we went over here, we saved the player's wooden sword to the weapon for deactivation. And since that's the first weapon he starts with, that gets saved. Then we turn it off, right? So we're specifying the game object. We're using the variable weapon for deactivation. Uncheck the box, it'll turn off the weapon. And then I have this next frame event here, which is just basically instead of transitioning the state machine, because a state machine can have many transition states inside of the update, but we don't necessarily want to do that. So this basically waits for the next update to occur, which is the next frame, and then it sends the event finished. Make sure you get this in there. You'll get some slightly unexpected behavior if you don't have the next frame event in there. It'll take a while to get the hang of this next frame event thing, but it basically prevents state machines from looping more than 1,000 times in less than a second, which can get really funky. And then once we hit our finish, we go to this get next state, which get next is basically it's going to get the next weapon in the inventory. All right, so remember we're saving all of our weapons in a global game object array called equipable weapons. These are the default values, leave them alone. The loop event is get next weapon, and we have this reset flag, right? So this is where you'll want to introduce the reset flag. Like yours will be set to none, right, at default. That's when you want to go in here and do a new variable and call it reset. And then once you've done that, you'll want to go over to the initialize state and use this set bool action, and then uncheck that, right? Because a bool is basically it's an on or an off. So this is off, this is on. And then you'll probably need a next frame event there as well. All right, so, and then the result, right? So what this means is like when it gets the next item in the equipable weapons array, which is your inventory, we want to store the result in a new variable, right? So you this drop down here as a new variable and just type next weapon, or next weapon, this is what you should call it. And then the current index you also need to save, and then just save that into a new variable called current index. And what the index is its position in the array. So like arrays all start at 0. So right now the player wooden sword is always going to be weapon 0. So you see here I've got current index showing up in my inspector. It's currently set to 0. So if I go up here, oops, sorry. Gonna go up here, gonna grab a couple of weapons, press F to change them. And every time I press F, you see the current index increases by 1. And when it gets to the end, it resets. All right? So make sure that you are saving the current index, because we'll use that later. So after it's gone through, it's gotten the next item in the array, it calls this this get next weapon event. And this activate next will turn on our next weapon. So it actually turns off our previous weapon, gets the next one, then turns it on. And that's an activate game object. We are specifying the game object. We are using a variable, right? So click this button, and we are getting the next weapon, which, if you remember, we are storing the result from our array get next action in this next weapon variable, and we're using it right here, right away. And check activate. Make sure that that's checked. And then we want to do set the game object, right? So just like we did for our default sword, we set it up to be deactivated. We're going to set up the current weapon to become the next weapon to be deactivated. So we're setting using another set game object action, and the variable we want to set is the weapon for deactivation. We're going to use a variable, and we're going to use the we're going to use the next weapon, which is the current weapon, technically, to become the weapon for deactivation. So let's see here. I'm going to run through that real fast while we're playing so you can kind of see what that looks like. So here's next weapon, and then here's weapon for deactivation, right? So currently, I hit play. The wooden sword is set for deactivation. That's the first one to go. So I went ahead and got the sword and the lance. I'm going to switch to the sword, and the sword is now next for deactivation. I press F. The lance is the current weapon. It's also the next weapon and the current weapon and the weapon next for deactivation. So that'll be a little bit confusing, but if you think about it as just like, okay, I've activated the next weapon, I'm now going to save it for my deactivation event. Like you could probably try to piggyback those variables and be a little more, quote unquote efficient, but I think it just gets a little too confusing to not actively save your weapon for deactivation into another variable, even though they have the same value. All right, so now what we want to do is we're also going to check for an array length, and we're going to compare. Let's see, do I actually still need this action? I'm sorry, when I put this together, it was really late at night. Yeah, I'm not sure that I actually need this state. Let me test real fast. because yeah, if they're equal, if I have 1, it goes, but it wouldn't. Yeah, so this looks like, yeah, this is from an earlier design, I think. Let me see if I can actually get this equal to fire. Nope, okay. So I don't think we actually need this action. I'm sorry, this state. Let me go ahead and play through it real quick. Sorry to make you sit through this, but it's actually... Okay, yeah, so yeah, you can see the reset array is being called there. Okay, so I'm actually going to just delete this action. We don't need it. Okay, so after we've set the weapon that just gets equipped to now be the next weapon to be deactivated, we need to check our array length and see if is our current index matching the length of the entire array. Because if it is, so if our current index matches the length of the array, we need to flag the array to be reset to start over at the beginning. So I have this int operator right here, and I'm taking the current index and I'm adding 1 to it, right? So the reason I'm doing that is arrays start at 0, but when they report their length, right? So if I have 5, if my array length is 5, right? That means I've got 5 objects in my array. Actually, I'll just use the example here that we have in front of us. I won't give you an example that doesn't apply directly to the situation. Okay, so my character is fully loaded up. The length of his array is 4. He has 4 weapons. However, the index, meaning the number of the last item in the array, is 3. And that's because when all arrays start at 0, they don't start at 1. So I have to add 1 to the current index to test it for being equal to the length of the array. So that's what this is here. So I'm taking the current index, I'm adding 1, right? So the operation is set to add, and you've got all these that you can do here. So taking the current index that we get all the way back here, right? Remember, we're saving the current index on the get next state. And I'm adding 1, and then I'm still storing the result into a new variable called current index 1. And you just do a new variable there and name it that. And then I'm getting an array length of the equipable weapons, right? That's the only array I've got, so it's in my global right there. Oops, I still have that one I just added. That was for demonstration purposes of how to make a variable. Forget that one exists. It won't. Make sure that every frame is not checked. I checked that by accident. So I'm getting the length again of the array, just to make sure. And then I'm comparing current index plus 1, or current index 1, to the number of weapons, right? So I'm saving the length of equipable weapons to number of weapons. And if they're equal, we have this reset array action, which we'll go over here. So we have a state for reset and have a state for continue. So if it's less, so if the current index is less than the number of weapons, or current index plus 1 is less than the number of weapons, that means we're not at the end. We don't need to reset the array. However, if the current index is equal to the number of weapons, right? So if I've got 4 weapons and the current index plus 1 is 4, that means I'm at the end of the array. I actually need to reset it. So I've got this reset state. We go over here, and all I'm doing is I'm setting bool value, right? So it's that reset bool that we have, and instead of the being negative, it's set to true. And the continue is literally a copy and paste but renamed, right? So it's got a set bool value. It's setting the reset value to false. No need to reset. And both of these states just then feed back into listen. And that is how this state machine works. And this flag, it gets called, so basically it's just checking like, hey, when this is finally true, I reset the array. It just handles that internally. There's nothing else you got to do for it. It's pretty nice and handy. So I'm just going to take a moment to click on all of these again, let you get a chance to look at them. So it's easy to pause here and go through and study this. Hopefully you've been taking notes. Oh yeah, did I cover this one? Okay, so the listen state is just, it's get key down. You pick your key that you want and then you send the event when that, you don't need to store the result for this either. Checking if there's more than one weapon. If there's not, we go back to listen. If there is more than one weapon, go ahead and deactivate the current weapon, which will be the, in this case, it's almost always going to be the, well, no, I shouldn't say that. Just deactivate the current weapon. We get the next weapon in the inventory. We activate that weapon, and we save it for deactivation when its turn is up. Then we compare the current weapon's index, like where does it occur in the inventory. We compare it to the overall size of the array. If the current weapon's index is equal to the size of the array, we flag the array for reset. If it is not equal, we flag the array to not reset. And then we go back to listen and we wait for it to happen all over again. And these are all the variables that are used. So one thing that might be helpful to you if you're taking notes is to look at all these variables and just kind of write a note next to what each one of these does. Can I add notes here? No. This one compares, this is the one that does all the comparison for flagging. Set bool value false, set bool value true. Those are the events being used. All right, we'll go on now to the the states that are happening on the actual weapons.